Welcome back to freepilotgroundschool.ca. This lesson, the fifth lesson in our air loss series on airspace. This is a really important lesson. A lot of pilots don't understand airspace. They don't understand what they're supposed to do when they get into different kinds of airspace, whether it's controlled or uncontrolled. And what ends up happening is they inadvertently fly somewhere where they probably should have gotten a clearance from air traffic control. So please pay attention. It's a bit of dry material, but I'll try to make it somewhat interesting and interactive with you. But it is an important lesson. Let's start with some boring definitions that we have to cover. The ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. It's an area around the coast of, around Canada's borders, other than the southern border that we share with the United States. It's defined in the Designated Airspace Handbook, and within this area, you must always have a flight plan and air traffic control. And actually, in effect, the military wants to know every single aircraft that's in this zone. This is probably a holdover back from the Cold War days when they were worried about the Soviets crossing overhead the poles and attacking the United States with their long-range bombers via Canada. But it's still in effect. Our second definition, aerial application. It's like your crop dusting. Large aircraft is an aircraft with a maximum permissible takeoff weight of 5,700 kilograms, or 12,566 pounds. Okay, let's move on to airspace structure. So when we talk about airspace, we can roughly split it up into two. We can talk about controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace. Let's talk about controlled airspace first. So controlled airspace is airspace where there is some sort of air traffic control. And there's a pretty long list of different types of airspace. And we'll talk about this later on in the lesson. But you should know that controlled airspace, it includes the Arctic control area, northern control area. So that's in the north. Northern Canada, we have a southern control area, and these control areas are all above 18,000 feet. You don't need to know that for your private license, but 18,000 feet, and then it goes up 23 and 28,000 feet for the northern and Arctic as well. But we'll save that for your airline transport pilot license exam. But you should know that controlled airspace includes airways. You should know that it includes terminal control areas, control zones, and restricted airspace, as well as the other airspaces listed here. All control zones are controlled airports, but not all controlled airspace is a control zone. And I'm going to make this a bit more clear to you later on in the lesson when we look at a map, at a VNC, what we call a visual terminal or a visual navigation chart, and try to make this a bit more clear for you, because it is a bit overwhelming, but it should clear up once we actually look at it in practice. Okay, let's look at uncontrolled airspace. So uncontrolled airspace includes high and low level airspace. It includes air routes, fixed RNAV routes, and then it also includes some restricted, advisory, military, and danger areas. The key thing to take away from this, air routes, which we'll show on a map, are uncontrolled, whereas airways are controlled airspace. Airspace can be defined or classified in a number of different classifications denoted by different letters. Controlled airspace can be A, B, C, D, E, or F, and uncontrolled airspace is G and sometimes F. We'll talk about these in just a moment. So what do all these airspace classifications mean? Here's an airspace chart that's also found on the website in the supplementary information, which I encourage you to download and really take some time looking at. And grab also your map, your VNC, and try to figure out how this airspace structure works. So let's get started with A. So we can see from this chart, this airspace chart, A airspace is between, it's at the top here. Let's take a look. I just circled it. It's kind of a poor choice of colors, sorry, because it's red anyway. There we go. A, it's above flight level 180, so 18,000 feet, and it goes all the way up to 60,000 feet. And I'll discuss this airspace a bit more, what it all entails in a little bit. Then we have our B airspace. Let's take a look here, right here. And that's between 12,500 feet and 18,000 feet. Now let's look at C and D. C and D, here we have C and D. These are our terminal control areas. Some people call this like the inverted wedding cake. You can kind of see how it looks like. Looks like if you had a wedding cake, you put it upside down, and the higher you get, the bigger it gets. And we'll look again at this on your VNC. These are all B, C, D, or D airspace. Then at the bottom here, in a terminal control area at the bottom, we have a control zone. And this is the area, usually a radius of 5 nautical miles, sometimes 7 nautical miles, going up to approximately 3,000 feet above the airport elevation, where the control tower tells everyone where to go and what to do. And this is usually a Class C or Class D airspace. Sometimes it's an E. We'll talk about that nuance a bit later. Then we have a lot of Class E airspace right here. And a good chunk of our airspace is Class E. These are your low-level airways. You'll see a lot of these between 2,200 AGL and 12,500 feet ASL when we're close to big airports, because big airports have lots of airways, whereas we go somewhere farther north, there's not going to be as many airways. Then we have Class F. This is your special use airspace, which we'll talk about a bit more later, but it's basically restricted, military, danger, advisory. And then lastly, we have everything else, G. That's your uncontrolled airspace. And that's all the airspace that's surrounding all of these other classifications. We'll look at. Okay, we can talk about transponder airspace. This is airspace where transponders are required. It's always in Class B, A, B, and C, or wherever else is designated, typically in, let's say, category or Class D control zone. It's often labeled on a VNC map. So let's just take a look here. You see how it says Mode C in this area outside of Thunder Bay? You do require a Mode C transponder. So that Mode C means it shows the altitude to air traffic control. And in Class F airspace, this airspace is designated in the Designated Airspace Handbook, and it could be a number of things. It could be, let's say, a military restricted area. And if you're going to go through it, you do need to comply with the restrictions given. Okay, let's talk about some airspace. Class A airspace, you have to be under instrument flight rules. So no VFR flight unless approved prior. It's pretty much all you need to know. If you're working on your private license, you're probably not going to be flying in Class A airspace. This is the domain of jets that are going up high and traveling. Class B airspace, between 12,500 and 18,000 feet, you do need to have an air traffic control clearance. And that's the important thing that you need to remember. You can't just go above 12,500 feet without getting a controlled VFR clearance. If the weather goes bad and becomes instrument meteorological conditions, you have to get an IFR clearance, or you must leave the airspace. Okay, let's talk about VFR flight in Class C airspace and Class D airspace. And this is really important because the majority of your time as a private pilot will be spent flying in Class C and Class D airspace, most likely control zones. So if you want to fly in a Class C airspace, you must have an ATC clearance. Okay, so prior to entering, you're going to call air traffic control, ask for a clearance. They will clear you into the control zone. Now, the difference between that and Class D airspace, Class D control zones typically, is that with Class C, you must get a clearance, where Class D, you must notify ATC prior to entering. So there's the difference. C, you get permission. D, you tell them you're coming in. However, they can tell you to stay clear of that control zone if they're too busy. Now, here's something else. This is almost, I see this on a lot of tests and exams. When a Class C control zone or Class D control zone closes, it becomes a Class E control zone, which we'll talk about a bit more in a minute. Okay, let's talk about Class E airspace and VFR flight in Class E airspace. And even though Class E airspace is controlled, it's controlled airspace, you do not need an ATC clearance to fly in Class E airspace when you are VFR. However, like we said in the previous slide, Class C and D airspace, or Class C and D control zones, may become or will become Class E control zones when closed. So even though you don't need an ATC clearance anymore because the control tower is closed, your MF, your mandatory frequency procedures, may apply. Now, these procedures we'll talk about in a later lesson when we talk about mandatory frequencies and aerodrome traffic frequencies. Okay, so like I said earlier, the best way for students to typically learn airspace structure is to grab their map and to take a look at it. And we're going to do that now. We're going to go through it. So you can look at this map. Maybe after you're done this lesson, you can go through your own map and study it for yourself and see if you can figure out what the different kinds of airspace are. So let's look here. Here we are in Thunder Bay. Okay. Now, what kind of airspace is above 18,000 feet or flight level 180? So think vertically coming up from this map. That's Class A airspace. Between 12,500 feet and flight level 180, that's Class B airspace. Okay, so we got A and B taken care of. Now let's talk about this control zone right here. Okay, and you can see this ring right around here. We can see this is your control zone. And what kind of airspace is this? So remember, control zones are either category or Class C airspace or Class D airspace. We can look right here and hopefully you can see it. CZD, it says right there. Control zone D, 4,000, and then brackets 3,200 feet. So what that means is it's a Class D control zone. The top is at 4,000 feet ASL or 3,300 feet AGL because the elevation is approximately 700 feet in Thunder Bay. So that's our Class D control zone. Let's talk about some other things. Look right here. Okay. E, 4,500. And this is this terminal control area that we're talking about. And I'll just make a marking around it. You see right around here. Okay. And if you looked at this map at a bigger scale, it would go all the way around. It's approximately 40 miles out. And that's Class E airspace above 4,000 feet ASL. Okay, so what that means is that you need VFR weather minima for controlled airspace, 3 miles visibility, flight visibility. We'll talk about that later. But this area is Class E airspace. So, question for you, does this airspace require an ATC clearance because it's a controlled airspace? The answer is no, it doesn't, because we're VFR. However, IFR, instrument flight rules traffic, that traffic that is flying in clouds, does require a clearance. But for VFR, we do not require a clearance in Class E airspace. What we do require, though, is a transponder. You see mode C. So even though we're VFR and we don't legally need to talk to anybody, we still need a transponder so they can see who we are and where we are. Now remember how we talked about this kind of inverted wedding cake shape? Look at this ring right here, okay? All the way around, this goes 10, 15 miles out, okay? And here, E3000. So if you think of this inverted wedding cake, in the center, we had our Class D control zone. Then starting at 3,000 feet up to 12,500 feet, we have a Class E terminal control area. And then starting at 4,000 feet, we have a Class E, the next layer of that inverted wedding cake. Okay, now let's take a look right here. See this line right here? Okay, this is called a low-level airway or Victor airway. What type of airspace is this? This is Class E airspace. It is controlled airspace, but like we just said, for VFR, we do not require clearance. But what we do require is VFR flight minima, which we will talk about later. The bottom of the low-level airway starts at 2,200 feet AGL, and then it tops out at 18,000 feet. Let's look at, so we've gone through E. Take a look right down here. This is Class F airspace. Do you see the markings here? Now, because the map, I could only get a map so big on this computer screen, you'll have to look at your map and look for this kind of area. And that, I believe, is, if you were to look at it, is military control area. It's in the United States airspace, and it forms part of their military training area. That's Class F, restricted airspace. Lastly, let's think about Class G. Class G is everything else, okay? So here we have a Victor Airway right here, we said already. Now let's go up here, like in this area. This here is all going to be Class G airspace, all the way up to 12,500 feet. There's some other restrictions for airspace. Let's say forest fire. When there's a forest fire, you cannot operate within 5 nautical miles of the forest fire and less than 3,000 feet. That's probably because there are forest firefighting aircraft that are flying at that altitude, and they probably have better things to worry about than you and where you are. They're pretty busy fighting the fire. During that time, the Minister, Transport Canada, will issue a NOTAM to notify the location of the forest fire. Okay, here's our quick review about the different classes of airspace. Class A is IFR only, between 18,000 feet and 60,000 feet. Class B is controlled VFR or IFR, between 12,500 feet and just below 18,000 feet. You need a clearance to enter Class B airspace. Class C and D airspace are control zones. Class C, you need a clearance. Class D, you need to advise air traffic control. Class E airspace is miscellaneous controlled airspace, such as low-level airways, your VFR, and therefore no clearance is required. Class F airspace is special use, such as military. It's subclassified into restricted, danger, and advisory, and you get details by NOTAM and look at your map. Class G airspace is uncontrolled airspace. Okay, so let's work our way through some sample test questions regarding airspace. VFR flight in Class B airspace requires radio, transponder, ATC clearance, or all of the above. Well, we know that Class B airspace requires an ATC clearance. So C is definitely correct. Now, if you want an air traffic control clearance, you generally need a radio. So A is also correct. And then if we recall, we also require a transponder. So the correct answer is D. All of the above are correct. Our next question is, flights in a control zone require a transponder. This is kind of a tricky question, and it goes kind of back to how Transport Canada likes asking questions, and they always ask for the most correct answer. It's not only a correct answer. They might give you several correct answers, but it's the most correct answer, which does make it a bit tricky. So flights in a control zone require a transponder. Only in Class C airspace, only in Class C and D airspace. Those are kind of right because they're usually right, because usually they want a transponder in those airspaces. But the correct answer is in accordance with the designated airspace handbook. So all transponder airspace is given in this handbook. You're not actually going to look at it. Most people won't look at it anyway, but you should be aware of that. The pilot of an arriving VFR flight shall make initial radio contact with the control tower in Class C airspace. A, immediately after entering the control zone. B, 10 nautical miles outside of the control zone. C, prior to entering the control zone. D, immediately prior to joining the circuit. So you should know that to enter Class C airspace, you do need a clearance from air traffic control. So if you do need a clearance from air traffic control, you're going to have to call them, well, either 10 nautical miles outside the control zone or prior to entering the control zone. So it's nice to call them 10 nautical miles outside the control zone so they can plan for you. But the correct answer is C, prior to entering the control zone to get your VFR clearance into the control zone. Unless otherwise authorized, a pilot on a VFR flight operating within a Class C terminal control area must A, exit the airspace whenever the weather deteriorates below VFR limits. B, establish radio contact with the appropriate ATC only when transiting the associated control zone. C, establish and maintain radio communication with the appropriate ATC unit. D, contact radar service only when taking off at the major airport concerned. So again, most correct answer. So let's go through A, exit the airspace whenever the weather deteriorates below VFR limits. That is kind of right. However, a pilot on a VFR flight can ask for an IFR clearance if so equipped. So it's not the correct answer. B, establish radio contact only when transiting a control zone. No, you have to maintain radio contract communication with them all the time in a Class C terminal control area. So that pretty much gives us D, C is the correct answer, and D, contact radar service only when taking off or landing at the major airport. No, it's not only when taking off, it's whenever you're in their airspace. So we looked at a terminal control area just a few slides back in Thunder Bay, right? And we talked about that for a bit as well. And we said we don't need to talk to anybody. But recall, that was a Class E airspace. And here we're talking about Class C airspace. So there is a difference. So VFR flight within a Class B airspace is permitted. So if we recall, you need a controlled VFR clearance. So let's go through this. A, only when flight visibility of 5 miles or better. No. For aircraft except gliders and balloons, it's actually, no, that's incorrect as well. Sometimes gliders and balloons go into Class B airspace, but they do need a radio, and so they do need a clearance. If the pilot holds a Class B airspace endorsement, well, you've never heard of that. I've never heard of that, so we can knock that one off. D, in accordance with the ATC clearance. Well, yeah, that's the correct answer. Class B airspace does require an ATC clearance. Okay, finally, our last question. Controlled airspace means all airspace of defined dimensions within which A, control zone regulations are enforced, B, security regulations are enforced, C, special VFR flight only is permitted, and D, an air traffic control service is provided. So remember, controlled airspace, it's a lot more than just control zones. So all control zones are controlled airspace, but there's a lot of high-level airspace and other low-level airspace. So A is incorrect. B, security regulations. I've never heard of these security regulations. Can cross that one off. C, special VFR flight only is permitted. Whenever you hear only, it's rare that it's going to be the right answer. D, an air traffic control service is provided. That is the correct answer. Controlled airspace is whenever ATC service is provided. Okay, that concludes our lesson on airspace. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'd encourage you, grab your VNC, look at different areas, see if you can pick out what kind of airspace is in different areas that you might be flying in, and what you would have to do, who you would have to talk to. And that will make your life as a pilot a lot easier, and especially as you get into your navigation exercises. Thanks, and we'll see you on our next lesson.